Hi, tell me which of these pics are from the real world and which from a sci-fi movie. This video is not for the climate change deniers. Instead, in this video, we are going to talk about one of the most important things that we should be doing to fight climate change, but unfortunately we aren't. And furthermore, no one is talking about that at the international stage. Not the governments, not the G7, and not even Greta Thunberg.
People are suffering. People are dying.
And that means the pictures that you saw earlier is most probably going to be our future, because we are already late as per the newest IPCC report.
It is too late to stop serious global warming, warns scientists.
Of course, the idea here is not to be cynical, but instead to start this conversation to something so central to our fight against the climate change. Now, as much as I would like to make a short video, this video is going to be a bit long, so I'm going to add an index so that you can directly jump to the part that you're interested in. In the last 5 years, we have had more apocalypse type events caused by climate change than in the last century. IPCC has unequivocally confirmed that climate change is happening because of the human activity.
It is unequivocal that human activities are responsible for climate change.
We are not just responsible for rapid globalization, but we are also responsible for the widespread and rapid destruction of the oceans, atmosphere, ice, and the biosphere. This didn't used to happen a couple of decades ago. Neither this, nor any of this. But let's look at the silver lining as well. In the last couple of years, climate change has been in the news every single day, and we are becoming more and more aware of the consequences of our actions.
Let's talk about climate change. People are calling it the crisis of our time, and it is.
Thanks to people like Greta Thunberg and events like Fridays for Future, younger generations are becoming more and more aware that we need to fight climate change. But the thing is, and I do not like saying this, all of this is for nothing. Like, such rallies and events are good, but we are going to lose the war against climate change if we do not talk about the real thing. COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, has given us the solution that all the countries who are creating pollution right now, who are responsible for creating pollution, should just stop immediately. And there's a magic number of 1.5 degrees centigrade. If the global temperatures rise more than 1.5 degrees, respect to like 100, 120 years ago, then from there on, there's no turning back. In the decades that follow, the pics that I showed you at the beginning is going to be a daily thing. And the way we are going right now, despite the regulations, we are going to reach that level within 15 years or even earlier. So, there is an immediate need for action. So that's the obvious thing. The countries causing pollution need to put an end to it. That's the only solution. But being realistic, these are countries we're talking about. Nothing happens immediately. There's years of planning and execution that goes into moving from non-renewable to renewable resources, and a lot of money would be needed. And this is going to be especially difficult for the poorer nations. In fact, this was even highlighted in the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015, the landmark international accord. But nothing was done. Now let's be more specific by what I mean by nothing has been done. Let's have a quick quiz. Think about it. Which of the countries are the most responsible for the climate crisis in 2021? We hear what Brazil is doing every day in the news. But these are the numbers. As per CO2 annual emissions, number 1, China. Number 2, US, India, Russia, Japan. Now we are told that most of the top 50 is made up of developing countries who are supposed to fight against climate change, and Europe is at the far front of the fight against climate change. But to give you a perspective, Brazil comes at 14th place, and all the G7 countries are in the top 20. And this is as of today. But, this is where it gets really interesting. But if you talk about per capita pollution, are you ready? G7 countries are at the top, ahead of China and by far of India. This is as of today. That means most of the people living in the developed countries are responsible for more contribution to climate change than countries like China, India, Brazil, and any other developing country for that matter. Let that sink in for a while. Anyway, climate change is about absolute numbers. So for absolute amounts, the conclusion is US, China, India, and other developing countries need to drastically reduce the pollution. Finally, let's talk about why this hasn't happened and will definitely not happen. Something I've been saying since the start of the video. Because we are looking at the present problem without taking into consideration the historical perspective. And any solution arrived at using this logic is never going to see the light of the day. Meaning, developing countries won't just forget that it's now their time to grow and become developed. When the developed countries are developed because of their use of the non-renewable resources and the fact that we are here right now. It's like judging a relationship by what you see in the last 1 hour instead of the last 10 years. That's insane. Let me give you a historical perspective and then we'll deep dive and try to find out what are those things that we are supposed to do as individuals and at the country level. A brief historical understanding. In 1700s, Industrial Revolution started where people started doing things in a streamlined fashion. Then we came up with the education system supporting the Industrial Revolution. All across the world, the countries that were good at it started growing. Wealth accumulation started happening, cool inventions started happening, like the coal engine led to trains, then came petrol, cars, flights, transistors, and the human civilization grew at a breakneck speed. The livability has drastically improved in the last 100 years, all because of the Industrial Revolution. The average GDP of the top developed countries in the last 120 years has gone from 0.06 trillion to 2.8 trillion. That's a 44-fold increase. But more interestingly, this is the number that we need to talk about. That is the sum of the GDP values of the top, let's say 15 Western countries in the last 120 years. It's $1,200 trillion. Wow, that's a large number. And let me tell you why is this important. Because this is the sum total of the GDP that these countries could have because of rampant use of fossil fuels. The prime reason why the whole world is in this climate crisis is because of these countries' crazy and blatant disregard of the nature for 120 years, and even more so before that. That's on an average approximately 70% of the GDP of the world, and that is on the lower side. Now broadly, percentage GDP is equal to percentage greenhouse gas production. That means Western countries have had $850 trillion worth of GDP, all due to the use of non-renewable resources. And it is because of that that now in the present they are in a position of offsetting the greenhouse gas production by investing a sum from that 850 trillion into green energy sources. For example, Miami Beach has spent more money than the country of Bangladesh to mitigate the risks of increasing water levels. Even though Bangladesh has lost many more lives and much more property damage. Why? Because they don't care about the people living in that country, they live or die, who cares? No, we know that the major sufferers of the climate change are the poorer countries. Then why aren't they doing anything? Because for the majority of developing countries, the first problem that they have is to put food on the table and survive in the present rather than thinking about the future. Simply put, they don't want to care about the climate change brought about by the actions of the developed world because they have more pressing issues at hand right now. So, what are the options? Developing countries can continue producing greenhouse gases until they reach the population equivalent to $1,200 trillion, which will be around 3,000 or even more. And at the same time, the Western countries should straight away drop to zero greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow. Now that we know is impossible. What is the second option? The Western countries should finance the investment into green energy sources for the developing world because they made the gains earlier. This was actually discussed in 2010 and the G7 countries call it climate finance, as per which $100 billion annually by 2020 was to be given to the developing countries by the developed ones. In fact, this has been in the news like hell in the last couple of weeks or so.
Sharma spoke about the whopping $100 billion that is being pledged to assist the vulnerable nations in tackling climate change.
How generous of the developed countries to cough up $100 billion. How absurd is that? That amount is basically less than 0.001% of the GDP gain that they have had because of their use of non-renewable resources. Isn't it completely insane that it's 0.001% and everyone is celebrating? Like, instead of talking about how insane it is, all the newspapers have been praising the Western countries' donation. Anyway, that means realistically, setting apart the joke of climate finance, we are at a deadlock. Western countries do not want to give any money to the developing ones, and the developing ones won't stop polluting. US is an exception here because they are in like both the categories. So the only way to resolve it can be the jungle law, by threatening the developing countries. The stronger wins. Now that could have worked 20 years ago, but now things have changed also in that regard. 70% of the people or even more of the population live in the developing countries like China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, etc. They also account for a larger share of GDP overall, and thus they are becoming stronger and more assertive in their demands, and hence the jungle law is not going to work here. So then what? Now these are two real solutions, let's say. Number one, an all-out war. The victor decides who will do what. Now even that isn't simple, because of all the political divisions around the world is divided into two equally poised sides of losing or winning. And of course, let's be realistic, we do not want thousands of nuclear bombs dropping everywhere.
And kills 50 to 60 to 70,000 people. We are now into.
So that brings me to the final solution, the only solution that we have to face the biggest threat that humanity has ever faced, climate change. The only solution is the real understanding of the Western countries, and more so of the people who form these countries. Enough with the rallies and events. Just go and visit some poverty-stricken countries, not the capitals, the poverty-stricken parts. They don't have anything, man, nothing at all. And you want these countries to invest in green resources to protect our future when their present is at stake here. The only way is for the wealthier countries to take into account the historical past and help finance the poorer nations. For example, in this purpose, we talk about India as being one of the top 10 economies in the world, so they are supposed to invest in green resources. The per capita GDP of India is less than 20 times than that of UK. Just imagine, whatever money you make, divided by 20 or maybe divided by 10, okay, because the cost of living is a bit more. At that point, are you going to care about climate change? I'm sorry, I understand that it will be difficult to go 2 steps backwards in your financial status in order to finance the poorer nations. But think like this is dirty money that we have been using in the Western countries. It was built through slavery, through regimes that choked the poorer nations in the past and used their resources for our own selfish motives. It is the time of reckoning of the mistakes and the oppression of the Western countries past. It is the only real way to save the future of the world. For the first time in human history, the dirty regime's future, that's unfortunately us, will have no option but to accept our forefathers' mistakes and save the world through our acceptance and sacrifices. It's greater than the jungle law. Is the law of nature now. That's why I say Fridays for Future is good. Making that one factory produce a little bit less waste is good. Saving that small wood in your town is good. Not using plastic bag when you go to a supermarket in a Western country is good. But it's too little, too late. It's time we talk about the reality and stop focusing on small issues to make us feel good about our actions towards saving the world from climate change. The only thing we can do is to sacrifice for the greater good, as people and as nations. Now, my cynical self at this point says, really? Really? We are going to do that? Sacrifice? We can see that now with the vaccinations. We want the booster shots when the poorer nations, they do not even have the vaccinations. I think we'll keep trying to look for better solutions. And that's how we all will perish. Because at the end of the day, we are more selfish than we are caring. We are more proud than we are accepting. In the end, we humans are just some self-serving race which can't even come together at such times. And perhaps the earth is better without us. If I'm wrong, prove me. Saying that climate change is the biggest problem facing humanity is good, but thinking that rallies and protests are going to do much isn't. If it's the biggest problem facing humanity, then that means it's not just the responsibility of the governments to do something, it's also ours to take some action, real action. Let's start a movement where we all give 20 to 30% of our salaries every single month to the poorer nations so that they can invest in green energy. Let's start buying lesser clothes. Let's start cooking all our meals at home instead of going out to eat. Let's not celebrate spending money on drinks and wasting food. Instead, let's celebrate by spending time together. Let's go for nature walks instead of catching planes to go to exotic locations. And for the young ones, let's put the same amount of effort that you put on Fridays for Future to convince your parents that you do not need the new iPhone every second year. Instead, they should give the money towards climate finance and make this climate finance at least 1,000 times more, which will still be 10 times lesser than the money that the Western countries have. The whole thing that I've been saying since the start. I don't know. I feel we are not capable of this. I feel we just keep focusing on saving that one tree in our backyard so that we feel that we are doing something. And meanwhile, we look for simpler solutions that come at no sacrifice until it's too late. Myself included in this. I feel we lose this war against climate change. I feel we lose our home because of our ego. But please, please, please prove me wrong.